Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Allison Green, Manager of Public Programs at the Art Students League of New York. Welcome to the League's live talks, and our great thanks goes to Golden Artist Colors, whose generous support helps make tonight's talk possible. A brief reminder that tonight's program will conclude with a Q&A, and it'll work like this. As you're watching on YouTube, you can enter your questions as YouTube comments right there in the live stream. At the end of the presentation, I'll be reading audience questions aloud to our speakers. Our topic tonight is on the life and art of Perle Fine. We are so excited to be sharing stories of this League alumna, influential member of the Abstract Expressionist movement, and resonant to many of us tuning in, I am sure, a believer in fighting it out with the canvas and remaining suspicious whenever the practice of painting becomes too easy. We have three speakers this evening approaching Fine's work from multifaceted perspectives. Kathleen Housley is an independent writer and researcher and author of 11 books, including the very topical Tranquil Power, The Art and Life of Perle Fine. Maddy Berezov is a steward of Perle Fine's legacy, which you'll learn more about shortly, and is president of AE Artworks, which organized the Perle Fine retrospective. And Susan Knowles is an art historian, museum curator, and public historian in Nashville, Tennessee. With Hofstra University Museum of Art and the Berezovs, Susan organized the traveling exhibition, Tranquil Power, The Art and Life of Perle Fine. Now, let us begin without any further hesitation. I will see you at the Q&A. Kathleen, take it away.
Hello, thank you, Allison. I speak for Susan and Maddy when I say that we are delighted to be with you tonight. Obviously, it'd be more wonderful to be with you in person, but we're delighted that Zoom gives us this opportunity. When I was working on the book on Perle Fine, Tranquil Power, I was often asked, why are you spending years working on this artist that we don't know much about? What is it about her that is that you've committed so much time to? Well, you know, one project leads to another project. And in this case, my first project was the biography of Emily Hall Tremaine, called Emily Hall Tremaine, Collector on the Cusp. Emily Hall Tremaine was one of the most eminent collectors of 20th century art. And Philip Johnson, who was a friend of hers, used to say that she had eyes like gimlets. And not only was her collection filled with Picassos and Mark Rothkos and Calders, etc., but she had the ability to pick out young artists and see in their work some great potential and then buy their work and promote their careers. And in this regard, too, were wonderful examples. She went to the studio of a young artist in the late 1950s and purchased a painting called Three Flags and another painting called White Flag, both of them costing about $1,000 each. The artist, of course, was Jasper Johns. And about 10 years later, she would sell Three Flags to the Whitney for $1 million. So too, she collected the art of a young artist who was making ends meet with commercial drawing, a person named Andy Warhol. Well, in the 1940s, one of the artists in whom she was most interested was Perle Fine. And when the Tremaine collection went on tour of the country, a tour that lasted 4 years and had over 30 venues, there were 3 works by Fine in that exhibition, which, as I said, was stunning in Jean Art, Pablo Picasso, Stuart Davis, over and over, very prominent names. Well, Perle was right in there. And there was one other painting in that show, and this is what you're looking at now, which was of profound importance. Tremaine had purchased the last painting of Piet Mondrian, the Victory Boogie Woogie, in 1944 very near after he had died. He died of pneumonia, working on this immense, highly important canvas. But at the very end, the very last week of his life, he had attached attached pieces of tape to it to experiment with the placement of some of the picture planes. And he had never had time to take the tape off and fill in those planes. So the painting was inherently unstable. And Tremaine, for good reason, did not want it to go on a 4-year tour of over 30 venues. So she approached Fine, knowing that Fine had studied Mondrian's techniques and his philosophy. And she asked Fine, would you make me not just a copy, but an interpretation? In other words, in your mind's eye, take off those pieces of tape and finish it. And Perle said yes. It was a massive undertaking, but it taught Perle an enormous amount about the nature of Mondrian's work, more than anything else would. In fact, when this painting finally went to the Hague Museum, Perle finds analytical charts and notes. Also, I made sure that they received a copy of those. They were that important. So here was this young woman at this time who was highly regarded by already one of the best collectors of art in the United States. And my question that launched me was, how come if Tremaine could make the reputation of young male artists that she collected, why did Perle's career not receive the same enormous upward trajectory? And questions sometimes really get to me. I get kind of excited and really want to pursue the answer. And I'm sure most of you who are listening are going to jump to the conclusion, that part of it was that Perle was a woman at a time when, as Perle used to complain, she could not get gallery representation. If she got gallery representation, then the paintings wouldn't sell because American collectors, other than Tremaine, wanted paintings that would increase in financial value, and they thought that the paintings of a woman would not increase in the way that a man would. So yes, Perle had that problem, but there was another problem, and it's one that I really want to share with you, because I think sometimes we don't step back and think about this. And I'm going to just read the first few paragraphs of my book, Tranquil Power, and then we'll go on from there. It is fascinating to read about troubled artists who pick fights, make outrageous statements, have numerous affairs, or abuse family and friends, all the while struggling in the isolation of their studios to create masterpieces. Often, the narrative line of their lives is filled with inward torment and outward action. Just when things begin to get dull, they decamp to a lonesome place, lop off an ear, find a new mistress, or get dead drunk and wrap their automobile around a tree. What about an artist who doesn't conform to that worn out yet compelling script? One who is reserved, doesn't wear outrageous clothes, has never thrown a bar stool, has strong convictions, but is not angrily argumentative, and is monogamous. Where is the drama in such a life? Shouldn't the quality of the art alone be sufficient to command attention? These questions are not rhetorical. In the United States, where personality and star quality have always been important, they pertain to which artists get recognized and written about during their lifetimes and beyond. They pertain to Perle Fine in particular, because she reached artistic maturity during the period of abstract expressionism, a style that the artist Robert Motherwell said had, quote, to do with a certain violence native to the American character, unquote. Fine was aware of that undercurrent of violence and refuted it in her art and life. Quote, I couldn't be aggressive. I'd have to do aggressive work to be aggressive, unquote, she said. Yet, during the formative years of abstract expressionism, Fine helped shape its direction, beginning with her inclusion in Peggy Guggenheim's groundbreaking exhibition, Salon for Young Artists, at her avant-garde gallery, Art of the Century. Between 1945 and 1953, Fine had 6 solo exhibitions in New York City at the Willard Gallery, the Nierendorf Gallery, and the Betty Parsons Gallery, and one at the M.H. de Young Memorial Museum in San Francisco. Over the course of her life, in which her style evolved from abstract expressionism into an evocative, color-saturated form of minimalism, she had 25 solo exhibitions and took part in more than 125 group shows at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and numerous other museums, galleries, and universities. Really great works, wrote Flaubert, have a serene look. Through small openings, one perceives precipices. Down at the bottom, there is darkness, vertigo, but above the whole soars something singularly sweet. That is the ideal of light, the smiling of the sun, and how calm it is, calm and strong. The highest and hardest thing in art seems to me to be to create a state of reverie, unquote. Flaubert could have been writing about Fine's art, for the words he used recur in over 40 years of art reviews, along with the words quiet, mystery, power, gentleness, beauty. Before I pass the baton on to Maddy, just a few quick facts of Perle's early life. She was born in 1905 in Malden, Massachusetts, and her parents were dairy farmers who had just immigrated from Eastern Europe. In fact, we pronounce her name Perle, but her family actually pronounced it Perle, with that little accent on the last syllable, but 2 syllables. And they were utterly supportive of her art. There is a beautiful story told in the family by a relative, and I'll just read this quote to you. Her parents were so proud of her. What she had done is she had covered her whole bedroom with paint and crayon, up the walls, over the ceilings. And her relative said, her parents were so proud of her, they never took them off. They were all over, everywhere she could reach, art, even over the bed. And she started drawing them, flowers, everything, well before she was old enough to go to school. Art was her life from the day she was born. Next slide, please. So here she is as a teenager, a young woman. She did study in Boston for a while, commercial art, but this will surprise no one who's listening. It was New York City, that she wanted to go to. That's where everything was happening in art. She considered Boston a backwater. So in the mid to late 1920s, she moved from Walden in the Boston area to New York City. And she went to the Grand Central Art School. Next slide, please. And although she didn't learn a lot there, she met this man. Now, Maddy's going to speak more about Maurice. But when they got married, yes, it's tried to say this, but this was a marriage made in heaven. Maurice absolutely was convinced and dedicated to the quality of Perle Fine's art. He felt that she was enormously gifted, more so than he was. And he was a very good artist himself. And he was willing to do everything he could to promote her, to help her in any way he could. What's important about this is there were many artist couples, as you know, like, for example, Lee Krasner and Jackson Pollock, or the de Koonings, where the woman backed off her career in order to support that of the man. In this case, it was just the opposite. Maurice just loved Perle and supported her as much as he could possibly do. Now, I'm going to pass this on to Maddy, who's going to pick up from there and go into her time, their time, at the Art Students League. Maddy.
Thank you, Kathleen. My name is Maddy Berezov, and my husband, Dave, was Perle Fine and Maurice Berezov's nephew. And I'd like to introduce you to Perle's early life as an art student, specifically her time at the Art Students League during the late 1930s. In an interview with Dorothy Seckler in 1968, Perle was asked if anything in her childhood had a bearing on her becoming an artist. And Perle replied no. But she does go on to say that it was school, grammar school and high school, that influenced her interest in art. I quote, "I guess what had a bearing on my interest was that starting almost immediately in grammar school, I did posters and started winning little prizes and getting encouragement that way. So that by the time I graduated high school, I knew very well I wanted to be an artist." After high school, Perle had to find a way to get to an art school. So she worked on a scholarship in the bursar office at the School of Practical Art in Boston, where she learned to draw from the model and painted whenever she could. But in the end, she knew that she would have to leave Boston for New York. And in the early 1928, she enrolled at the Grand Central School of Art and studied illustration with Pruitt Carter. Can I have Maurice, please? It was at the Grand Central where she met fellow artist Maurice Berezov, who she later marries in 1930. Can I have the next one? The one in front of this, yes, thank you. For the rest of their lives, he was her greatest supporter, companion, and champion. Her first important adult award was winning first place in illustration at the annual student exhibition at Grand Central in 1928. I'm getting a pop-up. Thank you. Initially, she thought that she could be both an illustrator and a painter. During the 1930s, photography had not yet replaced illustrations in newspapers and magazines. And having to earn a living through painting would not produce enough wages, but illustrating did. Perle discovered that the well-heeled Bonwood Teller and Bergdorf Goodmans in Manhattan would hire freelance illustrators, and Perle could support herself using her Grand Central School training to sell one illustration of shoes per week, and that was enough to give her time to study and go to museums. Thank you. She loved going to the museums, reading art books, and constantly sketching. Can we go back to the sketchbook? With her free time, she would go to the Met, where she could examine the masters and make copies of their paintings. Rembrandt. She loved Rembrandt and learned enormously by copying him. As she said, it was exciting to see how, in a portrait, a gloved hand was pushed back ever so slightly to the point where it reached the picture plane and stayed on that plane, didn't come out from the plane. I copied anything that appealed to me, not for the sake of copying, but for the sake of finding out why. some things are just a lot of colors, and why some things are works of art. Next, she became dissatisfied with illustration and heard about the Art Students League from artist friend Vitlisil and enrolled. Her first class was in February 1935, and she studied both life and composition and paintings in Nicolaides' evening classes. She continued to study with Nicolaides until 1940, when she left for the Hans Hofmann School. She had a wonderful relationship with Nicolaides, and he taught her something very important. To quote, "He taught me that, as I wasn't at all sure of at the time, that I could make sure of later, and that was the idea of three-dimensionality. Because I thought that diametrically opposed to two-dimensionality, we learned that one equated two-dimensionality with three-dimensionality by using the planes. This doesn't register. In other words, if I hadn't had a sense of bulk, then everything what I would have done in the future would have been thin and flat, too thin, too flat." Nicolaides would have taught his classes by the principles in his book, The Natural Way to Draw. Perle saved many of those student works. In his book, Nicolaides starts by saying, "The arrangement of the text has been determined not by subject matter, but by schedules for work, because the work was the important thing." Perle relates a story during this period. "I think one has to work in one's own studio and be very severe with oneself as to the degree of art, and try to find out what it is that makes a work of art, and why what you have done may not have become a work of art." At one point around 1937, she and Maurice have two cold water flats, no heat, no hot water. They live in one and paint in the other. She sets up a still life of flowers and, to the best of her ability, paints. She stood back as if she were another person and critically approached the painting through another's eye. She noticed what it lacked and decided it needed color. But there was color. What was missing? And that led to what the Impressionists were doing, not mixing color, but laying colors next to each other. That painting then took on life and light. Then she was satisfied and said, quote, "Everything that I did came out of dissatisfaction," end quote. And Perle learned to draw the Nicolaides way. Perle did this image in class when she studied the lessons in weight and the model drawing. Another drawing exercise was the study of folds. Here she learned that every fold has three surfaces, and ultimately arriving at an understanding of the structural significance of the folds. The last paragraph in Nicolaides' book ends with, quote, "The job is to get to the truth as you will be able to understand it firsthand, arrived at by the use of all your senses. When you are really enthralled, really stimulated by a force other than the visual, strange looking things are apt to occur. But you will not judge your work by formula or conventional standards. There is always a bigger truth, undiscovered, unsaid, uncharted, until you meet it." Perle took this to heart. While in her late 50s and having been a professional artist for 20 years, interviewer Irving Sandler asked her if her recent work, her Cool series, was a reaction against the more gestural, so-called action painting in her earlier 1950 work. Her answer harks back to her student days at the Art Students League, and I quote, "Well, it isn't really a reaction. It's more of a growth. And again, I must say, it's a need within the painting it's a need within the painting itself to express more. A need to express something, and in this case, more color, more clarity through form. In my Cool series, I was looking at a more universal expression in doing this kind of work. And I think perhaps someday, when there will be a retrospective show, the paintings themselves will be able to tell the story better than I can in words." unquote. And there was a retrospective of her works. In 2009, inspired by Kathleen's book, Tranquil Power, The Art and Life of Perle Fine, Susan Knowles and I coordinated a traveling retrospective titled Tranquil Power, The Art of Perle Fine. The traveling show included not only Perle's paintings, but included Maurice's photographs of their artist friends. Nicolaides classes were an important part of Perle's development into a gifted artist. When I read Nicolaides' book, The Natural Way to Draw, I realized just how important these student works were to her. They were so important that she saved them her entire life. Susan. Susan?
Am I there?
Yes.
Okay, good. This photograph by Maurice Berezov shows Perle in front of a mantle with a still life behind it. It was taken in their flat at 51 West 8th Street around 1940 when they were living across the street from the Hans Hofmann School, which was at 52 West 8th. Next slide, please. I'm showing you here the catalog cover for the exhibition that Maddy just mentioned, the retrospective that we organized in conjunction with Hofstra University. And then it traveled for 2 years to other institutions that owned important pieces of Perle's work, including the Indiana University Museum of Art. As an art historian married to an artist, I'm keenly aware of what it takes to make an art career and live a life dedicated to making art, as well as how quickly reputations can fade. When Maddy and Dave Berezov approached me to organize a retrospective for Perle Fine, I had never heard of her, but they had the complete studio archives and contents. When I saw the work and read her resume, I saw the path. Contact the museums to see if they still own the works, research the listed exhibitions, and determine how and if her work was collected while she was alive. It was all there. I found articles, interviews, reviews, and correspondence in the archives. I read Kathleen Housley's Fine biography, and I was inspired by Perle Fine, a strong, independent woman dedicated above all else to making her art. Next slide, please. This is the title of my essay in the retrospective catalog, Persistent Vision, was an attempt to trace the conceptual and compositional through line in her work. She traveled through a progression of influences during the 30s and 40s, producing many beautiful paintings along the way, but in my view, not arriving at her maturity until the early to mid 1950s, after which she moved into the early 60s and up until the late 70s, producing several more distinctive series of work. Maddy's shown you a preview of a cool series, and you'll see more from Kathleen. Perle worked through the synthetic cubism of Braque. She admired Cezanne. She played with the shapes, but not the surrealistic content of Miro. She absorbed a bit of lyricism and spatial freedom of Kandinsky. And as Kathleen has mentioned, she analyzed the geometry of Mondrian, but always with as much or more attention to medium, technique, composition, and color as style. She was skilled at titling her work too, quite poetic in fact. And many of the titles suggest music or sound, which were also important sources of inspiration for her. As Maddy has shown, Perle set out to master classical academic technique first, then moved on to exploring abstraction with Hans Hofmann. Yet at the same time, she was independent of her teacher, intent on experimenting in her own studio, making paintings with no physical subject at all, the type of art being promoted by Baroness Hilla Rebay. Rebay was the powerful director of the Museum of Non-Objective Painting, funded by wealthy patron Solomon Guggenheim, which had opened in 1939. Rebay, a painter herself, used some of the funding to support other artists with stipends for materials and small monetary awards. Perle was among them. In their correspondence can be found appeals for such support, accompanied by a pledge to do more fully non-objective work. When Peggy Guggenheim, niece of Solomon, opened her Art of the Century gallery in 1942, having fled the war in Europe, she too was showing European modern and surrealist artists. But she also offered visibility to a young emerging New York artists, most famously Jackson Pollock, but there were others. Perle Fine's true breakthrough moment may have been her inclusion in the 1943 Spring Salon for Young Artists that Kathleen mentioned. And I believe that Kathleen and Maddy together concluded that Perle might have fudged her birth year from 1905 to 1908 then, since the show was for artists 35 and under. And go back for a second, Allison, if you don't mind. These two photographs I just wanted to mention, again by Maurice Berezov, taken at the studio at Springs, Long Island, probably not too long after they had purchased property and built it. On the left, 1955, Sketching Outdoors. On the right, a painting entitled The Wind and the Sea, 1956. So when they moved out to the east end of Long Island, Perle on her own at first, a few other friends were already there, including Lee Krasner, whom she had met in Hoffman's classes. Next slide, please. This is the title page of Inge-Lise Ekman-Lane's essay, Perle Fine in the Language of Paint, in the catalog. We were so fortunate to have the expertise of the brilliant Inge-Lise Ekman-Lane, an early graduate of Cooperstown, along with her close friend, Nashville painting conservator Cynthia Kelsey Stowe, and they came to clean and examine many of the paintings on loan for the exhibition, as well as those chosen from the Fine studio. So we had the opportunity to invite Inge-Lise to write an insightful essay for the catalog from the perspective of an art conservator. And in it, she discussed the brush techniques Perle learned from Hoffman and the observations she took away from the close studies she had made of Mondrian. Inge-Lise particularly pointed out the many ways Perle made both of those her own, creating textural interest by painting different color areas differently in her canvases, so they bear close looking. Next, please. This is another wonderful Maurice Berezov photograph of Perle in Provincetown in the summers. Next, please. And here is a Hans Hofmann class with Perle in the center. He's demonstrating, as you can see, interesting to analyze, try to figure out who all these people are. But working with Hoffman helped Perle explore the European moderns, the Cubists and the Surrealists, while concentrating on his main emphasis, the relation of figural imagery to planes in space, contending with 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional surface, as Maddy has already mentioned, at being an interest of Perle's. Next, please. This painting was included in a show at the Museum of Non-Objective Painting in 1945. As you all know, this museum was later subsumed into what became the Guggenheim Museum. And the museum acquired the estate of another of Perle's earliest champions, art dealer Karl Nierendorf, who had fled Berlin during the war. He showed and supported Perle and also Louise Nevelson with a gallery stipend for several years in the late 1940s. So the Guggenheim owns a number of Perle finds that came out of that Nierendorf estate. Next, please. And here, after Peggy Guggenheim closed her Art of the Century gallery and returned to Europe in 1947, Maddy Parsons apparently took over most of her gallery artists. She gave Perle a solo exhibition in 1949. And Kathleen has identified this painting as Pink Harlequin. Next, please. It's interesting to contemplate the fact that Perle was invited to teach at the Black Mountain Summer Program in 1950, but she decided to go to Provincetown to work instead because she had to create a show for her second Maddy Parsons solo, which was in 1951. And of course, that was the same year as the 9th Street show. And we're showing here a poster designed by Franz Klein for the show. Completely artist organized, it was held in a space downtown near where many of the artists were living and working. You'll recognize many names here, but even all the artists who showed were not on the poster. And we also see commercial galleries, at least 3 of them owned by women, Grace Borganick, Maddy Parsons, and Marion Willard, That must have helped in some way, or perhaps loaned works. Now, while not directly sponsored by, the 9th Street show included many members of the club, also known as the Artists Club, started in 1948 by Ibram Lassaw, Philip Pavia, and a core group of other male artists, including Willem de Kooning. The club met regularly as a community to discuss ideas and socialize, later providing weekly programs open to the public. Perle became a member in 1949, invited by de Kooning. She was one of few women and one of a very small group of artists elected to voting membership. And we know this from the minutes kept by Pavia, and also that she participated regularly and was a presenting speaker from time to time. The recent book, 9th Street Women by Mary Gabriel, 2018, only includes 5 of the women who were in the show: Elaine de Kooning, Helen Frankenthaler, Grace Hartigan, Lee Krasner, Joan Mitchell. Even though I was disappointed that Perle was not included, it's a wonderfully engaging history, well documented and researched. And the author makes clear her whys, the leadership roles these women played in the first and second generations of the New York School, their rebellion against societal norms for women, and probably most especially their later fame. Many earlier histories of this period either focus on famous individual artists, mostly male, or if they were surveys, notably under-inclusive of women and many other artists. A big shout out to Kathleen, one among a pioneering group of feminist historians and scholarly biographers, lured by clues and intuition to read between and under the lines, to follow the careers of women and the others who were not only present, but in fact, like Perle, quite prominent at the time. I was already familiar with Mid-March Arts Press, which published Tranquil Power, from my years of going to the College Art Association conference book displays. Mid-March was doing the work, books on women artists, books by art critics, and especially books on lesser known artists, many written by other artists, like Jeffrey Dorfman's Out of the Picture, Milton Resnick and the New York School, Natalie Edgar's Club Without Walls, selections from the journals of Philip Pavia, The Baroness, the Mogul, and the Forgotten History of the First Guggenheim Museum by Rolf Scarlett, all of which I used in my research on Perle. And one of the true joys of working on the retrospective was a research trip to New York, where Maddy and I went to visit Cynthia Navarrete, the founding publisher of Mid-March, who was at the time of our visit about 85 years old, living in an art-filled apartment on the Upper West Side, still working, and with a mind as sharp as a tack. Next slide, please. I'm showing you Early Morning Garden because it is similar in feeling to the painting The Wind and the Sea, which Perle was working on in the 1956 Maurice Berezov photo we saw out at Springs. While she later denied that she was painting from nature, a 1968 oral history with Dorothy Seckler for the Archives of American Art, and Maddy's already quoted from this, but it's online on the archives, includes this quote from Perle. I remember the first years out on the island. Bill de Kooning came into the studio and he made some nice remarks about the paintings. And he said, but this is all out of doors. It's what you see out here, isn't it? You know, through a big studio window. And I said, well, yes, I guess so if you say so. Of course it wasn't, you know. But to what extent that it impressed itself upon me, I don't know. You know, sometimes the very black trunks of trees against the white snow and horizon lines. Certainly there is something very exciting about the country. De Kooning was not the only one to notice, however. Perle's painting entitled The Storm Departs was included in the Whitney's 1958 Nature in Abstraction show. Next. And here's another painting from this period, Estrella, which was apparently purchased by a collector from the same from the 1961 exhibit at Graham Gallery. It was used as the poster image. And that show also included this next painting, Pounding Surf, which is in this collection now of the Art Students League. It was apparently purchased by a collector from that exhibition, later donated to the Art Students League. What a stunning painting. Seen in retrospect, these works are masterpieces of abstract expressionism and merit recognition in themselves. Yet Perle Fine moved on in her work, seeking to express something more personal and essential, as Kathleen will now tell us. Kathleen.
During the 1950s, Perle Fine and her husband, as Susan said, built a place out on the Springs. And the title of the lecture tonight references Perle Fine being in exile. She didn't really go in exile, but she was profoundly fed up with the art world in New York City. And she felt that she needed to withdraw and to find time to fully explore the ideas that she was beginning to perceive, the direction she wanted to go. So by the end of the 1950s, she had a whole gallery exhibition ready to go. All the paintings were ready to go. And it was going to be in the Graham Gallery. I'm just going to read you just a quick paragraph from her. I had a whole exhibition ready to go, and I decided it was not going. I destroyed every painting there. I said, well, it's good, but it's not good enough. I learned more from that experience with no one there to say, save this one, don't do this. I had the feeling, and it was a very important feeling, that nobody cared really. Only I had to care enough to do this and to know that I could do better. And I had to destroy it in order for it not to exist. One of the things she was trying to get past was she felt that the paintings she had done at that point were too pretty. She did not want pretty. Next slide, please. So if the late 1950s was a solitary time for her, a time of reflection and reassessment, then the decade of the 1960s was for Fine a time to re-enter a profoundly changed New York art scene. There were many more galleries and of course new styles, the foremost being pop, to which Fine's quiet demeanor and work was in counterpoint. But she also had a new gallery. She had the Graham Gallery. And it was here that she first showed the paintings that she painted after the destruction. And that was the Cool series. And before you have Spanking Fresh. So this is the second of the Cool series that you've seen. And with this series, she worked with limited motifs and very subdued color. She said, these simplified works do not intend to be hard edge or soft edge. The expression is more than merely chemical or optical. It is metaphysical, unquote. It's interesting to me that she also said this series gave her a sense of deep peace, of being untroubled and yet elated. At about the same time, she began to teach at Hofstra, and she taught at Hofstra for very practical reasons. She was broke, and she had been teaching. She's taught for a year at Cornell, and Cornell offered her a position, and at the same time, Hofstra offered her position, and Fine said to them, well, if you can match Cornell's offer, I will accept. And they did. And of course, Hofstra was much easier for her because it was in the middle between the Springs out at the end of Long Island and New York City. So she taught there until 1973. Now, for those of you listening this evening, I'm sure you will sympathize with her because she quickly discovered that although she liked teaching and she liked interacting with the students, she found that it drew away from her the ability to create on her own. It was very time consuming, and it took a lot of intellectual energy and creativity to do. So by 1973, she decided it was time to give up the teaching. And one of the real reasons is that she had begun to redirect her thinking. As you see here in the Cool series, she was working with linear towards returning to the grid. And she wanted time to work on that series. Next slide, please. And she called this series, these paintings are beautiful works, but I have to warn you, they do not present well in photographs, which is what you're looking at. They are much more complex and more subtle than you're seeing. But she called the series the Accordment series. And she used that name because to her, it meant an acceptance, serene, tranquil evocations of being in tune with nature and the universe. And of the Accordment series, one art critic, Edgar Buonagiorgio, who was writing for Arts Magazine, wrote something that I find rather profound because to me it pertains to all of her works. He said, quote, "These are gentle paintings of near unspeakable beauty." And then he went on to say that they had an elusive, ethereal light about them, which he compared to Monet's water lilies, quote, "somehow boxed up and gone structural," unquote. These were the last major works that Perle Fine painted. In the 1980s, sadly, Alzheimer's began to come on. And she died in 1988, right up to the end, though, still drawing. Whenever Maurice would visit her, he would take paper and put the pencil or the marker in her hand, and she would draw more. I close tonight with one line where a curator was writing text for an exhibition, and he had sent her a copy that he wanted her to review. And he had written that she had reached, quote, "a plateau of translucent calm and repose," unquote. And in the edited text, Perle had crossed out the word translucent and written in imperturbable. And now we are going on to the questions.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Kathleen, Maddy, and Susan, for this conversation. It's been really exciting to go through Perle Fine's work. It also has been an art lesson, this shared lecture, where we're learning about her figure work, her fold studies, and then into her abstract. So that leads very well into the first question I have for you tonight. It is very rare that we get to discuss an artist on this much of her academic life and her career as a student. I think the legacy of artists, even those are contemporaries of Perle's working as Ab-X painters in 1950s New York, we're hearing a lot about these cult of personalities, these really kind of larger than life, crazy and non-academic journeys. So I'm curious, to what do you attribute Perle Fine's immense focus on the academic study of her work? I'm curious if it comes at all from her upbringing of having worked with her hands, but I'm wondering if you have any other thoughts on that. Looking through, and does this, there's a question for all three of you, so don't be shy. To our audience, we are still collecting cues for the Q&A, so please do continue to give us your comments and your questions right here in the YouTube chat. Maddy, Susan, Kathleen, are you all able to hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great.
Yes, I think Kathleen's muted, I think.
Oh, I see. Hi, Kathleen. So yes, while we're waiting for a couple audience questions to keep trickling in, let me just rephrase this one because we've spent so long talking about Perle Fine as a student, whereas the focus so often is on sort of the exciting life outside of academia. To what do you attribute Perle's really tremendous focus and the rigor that she opted into in her studio practice?
Susan, can you answer that?
Well, I would say she was very determined to become a professional artist. And so she went out and looked for what she thought she needed. And I think that idea that she would leave the Hoffman class and walk across the street to her studio and do works that she would never show him, which she said, because she had her own ideas about where she wanted to go and what she wanted to explore. So she, I think, was very purposeful in starting at Grand Central and then realizing that that illustration was going to support her up to a certain point, and then very practical until she could move to the League and study directly with artists who she admired and help mentor her and guide her. I believe that her one of the professors said to her, you know, Hoffman is somebody you might want to go and, isn't that true, Maddy? That one of her professors at the League actually said, I can't really teach you anymore. I think you might want to go and
that was probably the ladies.
Wow.
So, yeah.
But at some point, and Kathleen, you might remember this quote, she says that I could not paint. How did she phrase that? I could not stop painting as if I couldn't stop breathing. It was so innate and so much a part of her being that she couldn't stop painting.
Wow. Yeah, that comes across so clearly in her work. It does look like we may have lost Kathleen momentarily, but we are all in luck because Kathleen, of course, wrote the book. So you will, at the end of our program tonight, have to make sure that you check out Tranquil Power. And here's Kathleen returned again. I have another audience question here for the group. Hallie asks, Perle's Accordment series reminds me of Agnes Martin. Do you happen to know if they were influenced by each other in any way? Did they have any kind of connection?
Perle had a lot of respect for Agnes Martin. Perle's grid work actually predates Agnes Martin's. Her first grid work is in 1940-41. And she goes back to it a great deal, and she feels that Martin is a vital artist. And of course, they are in New York City at the same time. The big difference, of course, is Perle's use of color. Perle was exceptionally gifted in how she used color. And of course, Martin, in most of her work, did not. But a lot of respect between the two of them. I'm not sure that Perle was influenced by Agnes Martin, but they certainly respected each other.
I have a couple interesting questions here on a little bit more about Perle's personal life, her social life. Do we know what her relationships were with other women artists of her time, knowing that this was, of course, an additional challenge that she had to face being a woman working in this environment?
Do you want me to answer? Maddy, do you want to jump in on that with Lee Krasner?
Why don't you? You're more knowledgeable than I am on this. She did have, I mean, that as a unit, Perle and Maurice were very involved in the art world in New York. And they had many, many friends that were artists, as you saw from the photo from the retrospective. She was about painting. As she said, when she was living in the Springs, Maurice worked on Madison Avenue and kept the studio in the Village, and so they would travel. She would come into the city, go to shows. He would come out to Long Island on the train. She would pick him up and they'd spend the weekend together. They went back and forth, and all of the artists supported each other for the most part. She went to other openings. They went to her. She was very friendly with Rosenberg and May Natalie. I mean, it was a very large, cohesive group when you think about the artists of that time. There were a lot of artists doing very similar work, abstract expressionist in the 50s. But she was always about fighting it out on the canvas, on the island.
And I will say, I mentioned that she met Lee Krasner when they were both studying with Hoffman, and Ernestine and Ibram Lassaw lived out there too. And so Ernestine was a friend of Perle's, I'm sure, her whole long life as well. And in that Mary Gabriel book, she talks about how important Ernestine was before she met Ibram. She was a roommate of Elaine de Kooning's. And so these women did know each other and support each other and socialize together on their own. I mean, we know that, and Kathleen, when she gets audio, might be able to talk about that. But I think the fact that they knew each other and all ended up living in this very isolated community, but it was a place they could afford, and it still is kind of raw and beautiful. I mean, you can see it when you go out there.
Definitely.
Kathleen, did you have anything more to add about women friends, women artist friends? And well, the book, Kathleen's book is fantastic. And so I highly recommend it. And any of those Mid-March Arts Press books that you can get your hands on. Written by people who knew or who have access to the whole archives of somebody's work. And so.
Here's an interesting question, I think, to end on. We've returned to this idea throughout this talk, and a few different almost monikers are used to describe Perle Fine's work, such as tranquil, such as this distinction between translucency and imperturbability. So a question comes from Ranjou: calm style of painting, this word calm, which I relate to tranquility. Can you elaborate just a little bit more on what marks Perle Fine as having a calm style in her body of work?
Well, I think her personality had a lot to do with it. I understand. I've only met her once or twice before she became very ill. She was a tiny woman. Neither she nor Maurice were 5'2". They were very short, but very calm, sweet-spoken, gentle. Her personality was gentle. That's why she said, I couldn't be angry and paint angry works. It wasn't her personality.
Well,
and I think that's where I'm sorry, Susan.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, absolutely, Maddy, but she was a leader in that she was there. I mean, she helped with the 9th Street show. She was at the club. She was a presenter. She was a faithful member who was highly respected because she was also really, I think, well-read and intellectual and had her original ideas, and she could express them, as we've heard in these different quotes from Perle. But there's a force especially in those abstract expressionist period works that I think is, I don't know that calm quite says it. I feel like there's a lot of power in those works, and some of them, I mean, you can look at the titles and you can almost hear the pounding surf or the wave and undertow and other bits, and so that there's a lot of strength and in those paintings as well.
It's
So,
interesting. The titles really do kind of pull us into this other direction. And that's how we get the power of Tranquil Power. So again, please do check out Kathleen Housley's really wonderful book, Tranquil Power, The Art and Life of Perle Fine. I think this is a great moment for us to wrap up. And before you hear from me for the last time, I'm going to pass it over to Maddy one last time for just a little bit of a closing remark.
Thank you, Allison. I would like to share a few words, and those words are words of thanks. Several months ago, Anki King approached me with an opportunity for the Art Students League to host a seminar on Perle Fine. And of course, I agreed immediately. And then I immediately phoned Kathleen and Susan to see if they would participate. And here we are, wrapping up a tribute to a gifted artist at an institution where it all started, the Art Students League. I'd like to thank Anki for this opportunity and Allison and Andrew for making this happen. And none of us would be here if it weren't for Kathleen and Susan. Their unwavering support, enthusiasm, and insightful contributions are so much appreciated. And it is because of these ladies that Perle Fine is basking in the sunlight of the 21st century, no longer an under-recognized artist, no longer in exile. And I must give my thanks to the galleries that represent her, Barry Campbell in Chelsea and the Thomas McCormick Gallery in Chicago. Their support has been immeasurable throughout. Perle has a busy summer schedule. The Gazzelli Art House in London is hosting Perle Fine, a retrospective, May 20th through June 25th. The Aspen Art Fair, Women of Abstract Expressionism in July. Women of Abstraction in August on Long Island at Ashwell Hall, and The Shape of Freedom, International Abstraction After 1945, a European traveling show organized by the Museum Barberini in Potsdam, Germany. And thanks to you, the audience, for being with us tonight. Thank you.
Maddy, could not have said it better myself. Thank you everyone for tuning in. On behalf of the Art Students League, again, my great thanks to Maddy Berezov, Kathleen Housley, Susan Knowles. This has been such a pleasure. Please check out our website, artstudentsleague.org, to learn more about our upcoming public programs and of course our summer classes, which will be starting in June. And you can follow us on Instagram at ASLNYC. I'm Allison Green, wishing you a great rest of your evening. And as always, stay healthy.